Thank you for being here today. Happy Friday. We're here today with Mark McKnight and Paul Soto. I'm Bailey Mizell, the director of PAC LA. And we're here for an artist talk and virtual tour of Mark McKnight's current exhibition, Hunger for the Absolute, currently on view through tomorrow at Parkview Paul Soto Gallery. I just want to give a quick shout out today to our membership base and our board of directors for their ongoing support, making events like today possible. And I want to give another quick shout out to Kevin Burns at Mocha Tucson for your supporting today's talk, and for inviting your members today who are in the room with us. So hello and welcome. Just a quick run of show for today. Mark will be giving a 40 to 45 minute presentation. It's an artist talk, some earlier works that he'll present to us and walk us through. And then Paul Soto will join us for a virtual tour of Mark's current exhibition. And then we'll hop into a conversation and a Q&A following that. At any time during the presentation, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to add them to the chat in the Q&A box. I'll be here to moderate. I'll be off screen during the presentation, but come back towards the end for the conversation and Q&A. Just for a quick introduction, I'd like to introduce Mark. So I'm going to go ahead and read his bio, a short bio, and then we'll hop into the presentation. Mark McKnight has been exhibited internationally. His work has been written about in the Los Angeles Times, Interview, The New Yorker, GQ, Aperture, Art in America, Frieze, Brooklyn Rail, Moose, and Bomb Magazine, among others. Mark's the recipient of the 2019 Aperture Portfolio Prize, the 2020 Lightwork Photo Book Award, and the 2020 Rima Hortman Emerging Artist Grant. His work is in the collection of the Henry Art Gallery, Seattle, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. His first monograph, Heaven is a Prison, was published by Loose Joints in September 2020. Mark currently splits his time between Los Angeles and Albuquerque, where he is an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. And again, if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to the chat box during the presentation and in the Q&A. And again, welcome, Mark and Paul.
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you so much, everyone, for having Paul and I. Yeah, I guess the sort of format has been covered. So yeah, welcome Tucson friends and LA friends. And I'll just start rambling at you about my art practice and give you, hopefully, I'm gonna try and stay. I brought notes today. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm trying to stay on topic. I'm like notoriously masterful at going off into the weeds. So I'm going to try and stay on topic and keep this tight. I promise I'm not like texting people. If you see me look down, I'm just looking at my notes. So I'll share my screen and hopefully that works.
Yes, it works well.
Things are moving?
Yep.
Amazing. Yeah, so I guess I like to give just a little warning. Here are some of the things you can expect to see sorry, just let me click on one thing. In this talk, but really the thing that I think is probably most concerning for some is just sexual content. There is at least one image of anal penetration, but there are images of sex throughout this lecture. So just FYI. And I guess just to maybe lay some groundwork about me, I was born and raised in the high desert periphery of Los Angeles. I think my close proximity to the culture in LA proper, but also the sense of boredom I felt being on the geographical margins of it, not to mention the sense of isolation that was compounded by being young, brown, and secretly gay in a predominantly conservative white area. I think all of those things were really instrumental in making me who I am today, and also have subsequently informed my art practice. My mom is Mestizo Nuevo Mexicano. She's the last of 8 kids and the only one that was born in Los Angeles. Much of my family history is sort of severed. My grandfather fled New Mexico, family in tow, during the 1940s because of some circumstances that are definitely too complicated to get into here. But I will say that I think various historical traumas genocide, colonization, displacement, and the not uncommon results, mental illness, alcoholism, have all been brought to bear on my extended and immediate families, myself, and again, my subjectivity and subsequently my art practice. My father is a Southern white settler colonialist. I feel like that's probably where I get my taste in music from, but sometimes it feels like that's about it. Mostly my mother felt like my primary caregiver, so I grew up surrounded by my New Mexican family, namely brown women, and that's the experience with which I most identify. This is a picture of me in high school. It was in the yearbook. I got like a little section in the yearbook where they shouted me out for taking photographs because that's when I started. I started making pictures in the darkroom in high school. So that's really where it started. I also, another disclaimer just before we get going, I reserve the right to contradict myself anytime. Yeah, I guess, so I went to a community college after high school for a couple years, College of the Canyons. I studied photography there, and then eventually I transferred to the San Francisco Art Institute, which is, I think it's 150 this year. There was a big conversation actually recently about it closing. Everyone thought it was going to close, and that doesn't seem to be the case now. That's neither here nor there, though. So the photo program at SFAI, it's the first fine art photography program in the country, and the school is the first art school west of the Mississippi. The photo program was founded by people like Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Dorothea Lange, and Minor White, which is to say early, mostly modernist photographers. And I think that tradition runs rampant, although the department is, or in addition to that, the department is somewhat segregated from the rest of an otherwise forward-thinking institution with a somewhat radical history. At least that was the case in 2007 when I was a student. But also, when I was a student, it felt like a new generation of photographers were making what I can really only describe as like new topographics. Students were being exposed, myself included, to a great deal to the new topographics and a lot of its precedents. So Walker Evans and F64, as I've mentioned, all photographs and photographers that subscribed to certain tenets of a documentary style. That was also curiously referred to as straight photography. I think that has really influenced the way I think about and antagonize the medium, if not always directly in my work or at all, then in my thought life and my ideology and the things that I'm interested in and choose to privilege. I think a lot of these things still weigh heavily on my mind and practice, particularly the way that this notion of, quote, objectivity is primarily like born out of and often attributed to a very machismo, arguably colonizing tradition in photography that conflates things like, quote, purity, quote, straightness, and, quote, objectivity with, quote, truth, affirming one subjectivity as photographic fact to the detriment of all other subjectivities and worldviews. So yeah, just some of the kind of work that I was looking at, Louis Baltz, Stephen Shore, people that were informed, people that informed their practices, people like Robert Frank, bottom left, and then next generation, people like Joel Sternfeld, Mizrak, and then somebody like Alex Soth, who when I was finishing undergrad was just the god of photography, and someone whose work in some ways I emulated because as a student, one would have thought, based on the kind of work we were looking at and seeing, that if you wanted to work with a camera and be considered a serious artist, this was the kind of work that you made. Determined later that that was not the case, but it took a long time, probably a little too long. But so yeah, I'm going to skip a big chunk of stuff, work that I made straight out of undergrad. It feels like that work is, in a longer lecture, it does feel useful to talk about that work because it all led me to the place where I'm at now, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of that. But just a quick heads up. So in this time I'm skipping, I did a Fulbright in Finland, so lived there for a year, northern Finland, no light, Arctic Circle, basically. I also lived and made work in Las Vegas that was in a kind of social documentary tradition. And also, just to give you a sense of my personhood, I was closeted until 26 or 27, and also an active addict and alcoholic who finally came out, got sober, developed a kind of spiritual practice, and started graduate school, all in the tiny span of like 4 months or so. And then that's where I'm actually starting us, is right at the beginning of that kind of 4 months or so. So I started graduate school in 2012 with kind of all of that stuff on my mind, or shifting. And because I had attended such a traditional photo department for undergrad, I applied at UC Riverside, an interdisciplinary program with the intention of filling in some of my art historical kind of knowledge gaps. And also because I had a really strong desire to experiment with media outside of photography. I didn't necessarily feel like I needed to stop making photographs, but I think I understood that I was seeing it through a lens that wasn't mine somehow. After having made all of this work, as I said, in almost a kind of social documentary tradition, and then asking myself a lot of very serious questions about why I was making that work and whether I had the right to make some of that work, I felt like it was time to redirect my energy. I also should say that, I mean, my work now and forever will be, I suspect, firmly rooted in my personhood, identity, and subjectivity. And that can happen in a multitude of ways, but it's like, how could I have made work from a personal place prior to this period in my life? Like, I had no idea who I was. And so this moment in graduate school felt really formative. So for the first year or year and a half of grad school, I put down my camera in favor of working with provisional sculpture and ready-made. I produced rubbings, drawings, video, and worked with installation. I was reading a lot of poetry and redefining for myself what my priorities were as an artist. And I don't think I was fully cognizant of it at the time, but I think a lot of the work I was making was really about the burial of meaning within an art object, or thinking about latent meaning, or the way that meaning can sometimes be inapprehensible through language. And also I was thinking a lot about transcendence, not only of language, but also transcendence of the body, which is to say, in some ways, in terms of the spiritual. I mentioned I was really kind of amidst an existential crisis and coming to terms with who I actually was for the first time. I was making, for example, these rubbings that were the result of my having transcribed Emily Dickinson poems into Braille, only to translate them into rubbings and thus remove their legibility for a reader, even of Braille. Honestly, I think they're pretty awful as artworks, but I also think that they were important questions I was asking myself about the construction of meaning, about what constitutes a poem, or even thinking around the problem of how to clarify or manifest meaning in an artwork. Those are questions I'm still working through and frankly hope I never answer. Another one of these formative, albeit awful, artworks is this monument I had produced for Heaven's Gate. I won't go into the details of exactly why I was interested in this UFO cult in Southern California, but I can tell you that the sort of final manifestation of this object was these bronzed shoes, like the way you would bronze a baby shoe, but they're this sculpture that is designed through the use of certain materials and through the tied shoe and the emptiness of that shoe, that are designed to suggest heaviness, a kind of tetheredness to the earth, but also and also to suggest remembrance, but also the object was designed to suggest disembodiment and evacuation of the worldly body, which is, again, I'm pointing at the transcendent, although I don't think I fully understood that at the time. I was looking at a lot of post-war painting, work that was born out of the trauma of World War II. People like Fontana. I was really interested in Gutai and still am. Artists that were dealing with surface, but in a way that it felt like they were asking existential questions. They were artworks that were in many ways responses to trauma. I was also thinking about the anxiety of certain post-war artists around their sexualities and the way that tension found its way into their work in often buried or discreet ways. So people like Robert Rauschenberg, Ellsworth Kelly, Twombly, queer men of a certain generation that were navigating city spaces and also their sexuality behind closed doors. I was, of course, looking at those paintings and trying to figure out in what ways that kind of, how the sort of residue of that tension was making its way into the work. I think it was really that those interests and also the amalgamation of making rubbings, like I showed you, and thinking about the body and thinking through the pathos and anxiety of certain modes of painting, and also my spiritual life, that I started identifying all of these marks in the world that were illustrative of consequence. So a residue of an activity or an event to which the camera was not privy, but I was thinking about them not in terms of objectivity or new topographics or the man-altered landscape, but in terms of sort of broader things like presence, absence, time, abstraction, loss, empathy, and so on. And so this is some of that work that I was producing around that time that was the result, I think, of all of those things sort of colliding. In a 1966 New York Times review, James Dickey, the writer James Dickey, talks about another writer, a concrete poet, Marianne Moore, in this book that she had just put out called Tell Me, Granite, Steel, and Other Objects. And Dickey writes of this text by Marianne Moore in the New York Times. He writes, "What is heaven anyway but the power to dwell eternally among objects and actions of consequence?" He goes on to write about the potential of description to transcend mere description and enter the realm of poetry, which is like soul speaking to soul. And that felt like another way of talking about so many of the things I was already thinking about. So as I often do, I use that line, objects and actions of consequence, as a sort of umbrella title for my thesis and a lot of the work I was producing at that time, in the interest of kind of consolidating the different types of pictures I was making that ended up in that thesis show. I've sort of separated them out as if they were typologies, but I want to be clear, it was really important to me that all of these pictures sort of exist in these broader constellations of images that sort of spoke back and forth between each other. And so some of those pictures that I made, I refer to them as windows. I'm going to read you something really quickly that I wrote about the windows for an exhibition that I was included in at the California Museum of Photography, I guess a couple years ago now. But so in the window works, I've documented construction sites in which contractors have primitively cut into stucco as they attempt to unearth the architecture's original windows. The notion that one would bury a window is, of course, distressing to a photographer. I've committed my life to seeing through them. Much has been written about the window in photography. With these things in mind, the latent windows come to represent much more: truth, transparency, a desire to see beyond the skin of things, or even an attempt to apprehend meaning. At first, the intent to liberate such a window seems a noble endeavor, and later appears futile. Beyond the stucco, for the frustrated contractor, a brick wall; for the delighted photographer, one more surface, and an unexpected metaphor that exemplifies the absurdity of his entire undertaking. So if that sort of art speaky text didn't fully convey, I was making photographs of these surfaces that I kept finding around the Inland Empire in Los Angeles. There's several of these window pictures, and I was attracted to them at first formally on a kind of unconscious, intuitive level. And then after photographing several of them, I finally had the good luck of making one of these pictures on a day in which a building was actually being worked on. And so I found the contractor and was like, what are these? And I was made aware that, and it blew my mind, but in the absence of a technology that can find windows that have been buried by subsequent layers of architectural material, this is how they find windows. So they're basically trying to unbury the original window in a piece of architecture so that they can kind of liberate it. And I think there was something really, there's a kind of metaphor there that I was really attracted to, because of course I was making these images of surfaces, and still am making a lot of images that are about surface, but it's so much, my practice is so much about pointing what is beyond what we see, what is past surface. And so these were just a really exciting discovery for me. I also, around the time, I'll also say that, I should say that I think through, things get like stuck in my brain sometimes. I'll read something, or there'll be a couple of quotes that just feel like they're running laps around my brain and are kind of informing the work that I'm making at a given time, which is often why I'm so attracted to kind of pointing back at writers in the form of press releases or introductions or titles, as a way of sort of paying respect to, but also remembering sort of where I was at when I was producing the work. But so some texts that I was thinking a lot about around this time that informed some pictures I'm about to show you are this text by John Cage, I have nothing to say and I am saying it, and that is poetry as I need it. That's from a book he put out called Silence. And then also this text by Jack Kerouac. It's a set of something like 25 to 30 rules. It's called Belief in Technique for Modern Prose. And rule number 10 is no time for poetry, but exactly what is. And I think I really loved this text because it is, as I said, a prescription for writing poetry, but it is also kind of antagonizing what constitutes a poem to begin with. And in the act of doing that is poetry. And I think that was and still is very attractive to me. And so these are some images that I made that were informed by that. These are called, I call them removals. They're just the result of signage having fallen down that reveals the lathing that held it up. So I think in certain ways, it's like about what the absence of language looks like. And also these marks, although sort of diagrammatic, they also felt like a kind of language unto themselves. And I was really attracted to that they felt like their own language somehow. And yeah, so that's sort of where these pictures are coming from. I also, yeah, I guess this Louis Baltz I like to show, I like to show because there is undeniable, I think, aesthetic relationship between someone like Baltz and the pictures I was making at this time. Excuse me. But that is an actual Baltz quote on the bottom left. All good art is without art or author, which is just, for me, that's like knife to the chest, because I can't, I mean, you know, Baltz was a cis hetero white man of a certain generation who could imagine himself as the default subjectivity because he was. Um, I just, it's hard for me to imagine an artist, especially when I respect so much, saying something so absurd, or even suggesting that it is possible to divorce oneself from the work that they're producing. And so I like to kind of throw this picture up adjacent and just really drive it home that my practice is so much about, subjectivity, meaning in the emotive, as much, and I guess, yeah, but it's a kind of hybrid of Baltz and also someone like Stieglitz, who of course we all know because of equivalency, thinking about what the photograph is equivalent to, what it becomes a stand-in for. Yeah, in my case, emotion. How am I doing on time?
Okay, it's 3:27, about 30 minutes of time, so I think you're okay. As long as we keep moving forward.
Sure. So I guess that's sort of where a lot of the influences for my practice lie. I'll jump right into, so this is some other work that I was making when I was finishing grad school. I did a show at the Women's Building called He's Time, I'm Just a Clock, which is a line from a Bruce Hanley poem that was borrowed with his permission. Thank you, Bruce Hanley. And they are these sort of diaristic photographs of a lover, the then lost object of my affection. I was getting out of this really significant first gay relationship, and this is such an embarrassing show to talk about. But it is significant because it was the first time, I think, that I finally did something with all of these photographs that I had produced of another person that spoke more directly to my desire. And so I did this show in conjunction with my thesis. They both opened and closed around the same time. My thesis was obviously on campus at UC Riverside, and then this show happened in LA at the sort of historic Women's Building. And I think this was really the breakthrough, was not only kind of coming out in my art practice, like the images themselves speak very clearly to gay desire and I think absence and longing and loss, but also I think there was something really exciting and important about the fact that the surfaces on which these photographs hung were not dissimilar from the surfaces that I had literally depicted in the photographs that were on display across town. And I think sort of the project ever since in my practice has been sort of conflating landscape, object, architectural surface, and body in order to locate this subjectivity that I've been making an important case for already. So yeah, so that was the breakthrough moment, and that's really that's sort of been the project ever since. So I did these conjunctive shows, I started making work to all of these things, and yeah, installation I think has also become a really significant an important part of my practice. I'm really interested in the affective and suggestive potential of photography, and I use scale, framing, installation, and titles to foreground that. An image like this is titled Eros and Erosion, so the image suggests desire and degradation or entropy as two sides of the same coin. In other images or exhibitions, the significance doesn't just come from titles alone, but can also come from specific pairings or diptychs. I really like using scale to make one aware of their body. There's a kind of moving in and out that I think is important in an installation to kind of wake us up out of our passiveness. I think as an artist, one of the most difficult things, as an artist who works with photography, is making people stop and actually linger on the image. We live in such an image saturated culture, like people are swiping through their phones and I think wrongfully have this sense that they are able to interpret or process or digest images very rapidly. And I think the way that I use scale and installation and force you to kind of move to and fro is something that I use carefully to activate the body, and also because it's something that I think speaks to a particular kind of desire that I grew up feeling, right? It's like pushed and pulled towards the object of my affection. And I think there's a degree also of resistance in a lot of these pictures. Like, you can't fully see what I'm describing, and oftentimes that has to do with not only with scale, for example, making something really small, but also sort of obfuscating a subject's face, often having subjects turned away from the camera and thus us, and also, you know, quote unquote overprinting. So underexposing in camera and then overprinting in the darkroom, so that there are these kind of abyssal blacks in the photographs that do hold detail, oftentimes, but that you have to get really close to see, or that sometimes don't contain detail at all and therefore refuse you. I think those are things I'm really attracted to, especially because it feels like a way of sort of pushing back against some of these histories of photography that I studied kind of earlier on, that always felt really limiting. I've sort of never believed that a photograph can tell a quote unquote truth. I think, yeah, I'm as I mentioned, I'm way more interested in the suggestive potential of a photograph, and I really like refusing information, so that we have to empathize or speculate, or again linger on the images and sort of work our way through a kind of disjunct or abstract narrative. I'll also say that I think, in the way that a lot of my favorite poems function, the work kind of collectively points like around the things, but never directly at them. And I think photography has historically been considered as this medium that brings things to light and reveals, but I'm sort of interested in doing the opposite. Yeah, just in the intro, I'm going to try and get to the more recent. I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, so I got a book called Heaven is a Book. The landscape that I shot for this book, for this monograph, and for the two exhibitions that one of which is closing tomorrow at Paul's Gallery, the other of which just closed a few weeks ago in New York. So the landscape that I photographed for it is a landscape I've known since I was a child, which feels really important to me and to the work, even though none of this is made available in the images themselves. I've been making mental pictures of these places for decades. It's a landscape that I know intimately, and a landscape that I've really inscribed on my very being. In the interest of time, I won't read you this poem, but it is both the a portion of the press release for the exhibition. It's where the title for the sort of companion exhibitions comes, Hunger for the Absolute. And it's also, it's taken from this Frank Bidart poem, who was also very generous and allowed me to use it both as the introduction to the book and for this press release. If you don't know Frank's poetry, he's like a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. He's in his 80s, but absolutely brilliant. So I'd envisioned this project as a book, somewhat uncharacteristically, almost from the beginning. And when the publisher and I had started talking, I already had design ideas. I knew the book needed to come sealed and inside of one of these cloud images that is contained in the book and also in both exhibitions. But essentially the book, it's sealed in this image and necessitates being torn open or penetrated so that you can actually access the book itself. And that felt like a really important conceptual gesture. It forces the viewer to defile the otherwise pristine object and also makes them complicit in the act of, my voyeurism. It feels like my little nod to Stieglitz and equivalency in a sense that is equal parts homage and iconoclasm. I am interested in themes, in asking questions, and in equivocality more than, quote, stories, at least in any conventional narrative sense. In the book and in the exhibitions, for example, I was thinking about the ways in which love is paradoxically liberating and binding. I was also thinking about the ways in which pain, emotional or otherwise, can be a conduit for pleasure or deeper intimacy. In the book and the exhibitions, I've literalized that through the depiction of BDSM, but I think it works because BDSM is inherently so symbolic. It felt really like kind of a ready-made metaphor. I've been asked a few times recently if the book is a reimagining of the book of Genesis, and it's not, although I can understand why someone would ask. If anything, I see the protagonists in this project as a kind of Sisyphean pair that are bound for better or worse by their intimacies, by this landscape, and by a kind of universal cycle. I'm broadly interested in myths and allegories and origin stories because they seem to oscillate between concerns that are equal parts mortal and existential. The Old Testament, to bring it back to the Old Testament, begins with a story about shame, desire, submission, free will, access, and borders. Between bodies, Eve exists in simultaneity as an extension of Adam. She is both his former rib and his lover, but also between borders between geographies. So heaven, Eden, earth. I think these are fundamental human concerns, and I think of mythologies as just these kind of mirrors on which we collectively reflect. I think of them, and I think of my practice more broadly as being they're tools for thinking. They're not containers for thought. I make these photographs and reflect on what they mean to me, as in some ways as much as you might. These aren't an illustration with a specific read that I'm soliciting. Yeah, I think I'll probably hand it over to But yeah, Paul's gonna, rather than me show you these images on a screen, I'm gonna let Paul walk us through the show IRL. And as I said, happy to answer any questions if there are any. You're on mute, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. That was fantastic. Hi. Okay, yeah, so just to give everybody like a sense of the actual physical show, I'm gonna give you a little walkthrough. Let me clean my screen. Okay, so, oops, okay, there we go. Yeah, so this is a space, welcome. And I will start at the beginning. So yeah, Mark, I think very carefully chose a select number of works, since the space is obviously restricted by its physical size. And I think for the, one of the first times just exhibiting really sort of gave, a lot of space in terms of before, like for example, at the show, which maybe you saw the photos of at Aperture, there was more of a kind of sequencing that was going on. And I think that that's what's going on here as well. But each one seems to sort of speak to the next in a way where it can kind of stand on its own, or be understood as this kind of, as Mark said, sort of stanzic, poetic kind of structuring. So yeah, as Mark said, you know, he's playing with scale. So you have works that sort of overwhelm your body. And then these, which, for example, I mean, for me, my read on this is that it just becomes this more kind of examination. And there's this kind of objectivity that's sort of, you know, inlaid in this work, and having to kind of get physically close, and me to be more related, let's say, to my eye and to my face than this one, for example, which is kind of the main, let's say, when you walk in work, which, you know, when I saw in the book, I couldn't really picture what the scale would be, but now, like, I just couldn't imagine this work at any other scale. But it's like, it's very overwhelming, and, you know, the body, I think, starts to kind of feel like this sort of mountain, and the way that it's sort of squeezed into the frame is so interesting. And the hand, which is as big as my head, and you know, if anybody can come down and make it in person to the show, also, if you haven't already, I highly recommend, you know, trying to stop by tomorrow, because also just the quality of the prints, which are dealt in silver, are just so remarkable to see in person. But especially with something like this, where you have this sort of, again, like light and shadow, which Mark's playing with, like here in the hand, and then all of this sort of detail that suddenly gets read as you come up close. And then over here is a diptych, and this is a work Mark was very intentional about framing and setting up, you know, as a kind of two-part piece. And I think just to kind of open up whatever each image could suggest, whether it's this sort of cloud that just becomes this kind of formal, you know, sort of image, let's say, if it were on its own, versus like this image of these two men, and, you know, it's very like close in, and so it feels also to me like Mark's sort of implicated in it, but then he's even dramatizing even more with this, you know, very formal kind of matting job, which also kind of brings it to another place. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then over here we have another large scale work, which, yeah, to me, kind of, you know, more Mark was speaking about the work, I was just thinking about just, again, like your Mark, and I hadn't thought about it in a while, but this kind of revisitation of your sort of expansion in grad school, and like dealing with installation, dealing with sculpture. And to me, this work is so painterly, and also just the kind of formal drop of like a horizon line, and this kind of all over quality, in the way that, yeah, you kind of come in and out of this like field, and then you have the two in the center here. And yeah, it's I think it's very yeah, painterly. And then here, yeah, this diptych, which Mark's again set up, it's, you know, not necessarily, as opposed to the other one, which is very much like a two-part work. These are here together, but also may at some point exist separately, with one of the characters, performers, photographic subjects standing above the other with these chains, this kind of, yeah, again, monolithic sort of slightly menacing way. And then this tree, just kind of the most surprising work for me in many ways, but so unassuming, but just this black void sort of takes over on the bottom of the photo. So that's my walkthrough. Mark, if you want to remark on anything, or we can just go straight into the Q&As at 3:45. Wow.
Yeah, right. That was fast. And thank you for your walkthrough, Paul. I hope that you'll still be present for some Paul. Questions. So Mark, did you have any comments, any follow-up comments to the walkthrough? Sorry, I jumped in before you there.
Oh, I mean, I think I was just going to say, I kind of rushed through part of my lecture, but I really think a lot about like presentation strategies. And there was I did this it happens one time in the New York show and once in the LA show, where there's one work that is over matted and it gets that sort of perfect modernist like jewel box. And I think I mentioned homage and iconoclasm in terms of the design elements of the book, but I'm very aware of the histories of this medium, and there's a part of me that really likes to poke it a little bit. And so I have a tendency to choose certain images that I'm giving that jewel box overmat that actually feel like the most quote unquote explicit or abject, as a way of inserting myself into a kind of history in which my representation was absent. And so, yeah, again, it's like a weird Oedipal daddy issues thing, I'm sure, but it's like, looking at certain histories and trying to, dismantle them by redeploying certain aspects of them,
and also
or something.
challenging positionality, right, amongst your viewer, but also your view shed as the photographer and your subject field, right? I actually have one quick question, if we can kind of pop into the discussion. I know that you and Paul had some things you wanted to touch on, but I actually have a question that kind of echoes something you had mentioned about, on the subject of effective and suggestive potentiality of photography. I wanted to know if you can kind of expand or talk further about your collaborators or partners in your process space, right? So, your printmaker, sure, your curator, the viewer, but also the architectural space and your subject matter. I want to know a little bit more about how that informs that, effective, suggestive potentiality that you mentioned.
Can you ask it again?
Yeah, sure. I was just echoing something you had said about the effectiveness and suggestiveness, the potentiality of that in photography, and how that kind of informs your process heavily and broadly. So I just want to know, in my brain, I like to think of collaborators and partners in that process in photography. So I'm thinking about the actual physical space architecturally, how you mentioned, but also working with the curators and laying out that space. And then I imagine, or at least I consider architecture and the subject field also as a part of the collaboration and partnership in the process. So I wanted to see if you can kind of expand on that a little further, talk about your subject matter, the subject field of your photography. Is that...
Yeah. I mean, the main thing that I get excited, the most exciting part of the question, it's all great, but is the architectural part, is I think so much about that. I mean, they're probably not, Paul can attest to how mathematically incorrect it was, but I made like a 3D mock-up that I actually thought was mathematically correct, and made prints I made prints of every single work that was in the book plus more, like mini prints, and then they were all scaled at 1/16 for 11/14, 8x10, 16/20. And then I spent like 2 months playing dollhouse in my studio with the New York version of the show, which is 2 rooms, and then the LA version of the show, and was trying to figure out how I could convey some of the lyrical qualities or some of the more aggressive moments in the book that get divided by gray sort of end pages in the book. But I was trying to figure out how I could sort of have that affective punch, have that sort of those like dynamic moments, given, as Paul said, the limitations of a space, that there's like 60 something pictures in the book. It wouldn't make sense. And there's like 12 sequences or something. I didn't have 12 rooms to recreate those, and nor would I want to. It's like really fun to work through some of those problems and to bring the work to life in completely different ways using scale, which is something I hated not having in the book. So architecture becomes so important. Like I think about when you enter a space, what you're going to see on the left, what you're going to see on the right, what kind of tension is going to be produced by pictures on opposite walls. So if you're in the gallery and you're looking at one wall and you turn away from a picture, rather than following the exhibition like left to right or right to left, that there can be tension between images. I think about, it sounds so nuts, but I think about like invisible tethers almost going throughout the space of the gallery, where there's like this tension between images. And that has so much to do with what the architecture allows. Or sometimes the architecture gives me an idea. It's like, so here are the pictures I want to use. Here are, I know that certain pictures need to be a certain scale. So these are the kind of anchors. How do I use those anchors to create the conversation that I'm trying to create, and the tension or the poetry, most importantly, poetry that I'm trying to create?
Yeah, that was what stood out to me most, was that aspect of the very stanza-like gesture, which is the grouping and the laying out of the exhibition, but also with the tensions that you mentioned. It's like, you know, when you turn from a space to another space, you know, say there's an image that someone's like, oh, I don't want to be a part of. It's like, where's their body gathering? Where are they meeting, right? More than one viewer at a time. You're also guiding them in that way as well, right?
Sure.
So yeah, I fully appreciate that. I also had another point that I wanted to get to about poetry. I think I took some notes here. Yeah, it was with your, which series? Your removals series, I think is what you said it was called, removals. And I actually wanted to pick your brain about the idea of it in relation to erasure, right? And erasure in poetry, but also cultural erasure, non-place, and kind of forming or forging those spaces upon, you know, on your own with your work and your photography. But is there a relationship, like, do you consider in that series or in that same kind of headspace or thought space, do you consider often your work as in relation to erasure poetry, right? The idea of the negative, you know, the spaces that you kind of inform, but also the information that you're, you know, anti-information, you know, in your practice.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think I have. I mean, I should. I think we'll probably finish this and I'll start spending some time thinking about it. I think if there's like a thing, if there's like a word that comes to mind that feels related, it's palimpsest. It's like, yes. I think yes. of in my practice sometimes as that more broadly, that there's this constant, like, yeah, I think the palimpsest is exciting to me because it's about an accumulation of things and a simultaneous removal of them or an obfuscating of them. And I don't know if that, yeah, that doesn't answer your question, but it maybe points at something adjacent, related. Yeah. Psychologically, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you engaged the question perfectly. It was just a thought space that I wanted to kind of join you in.
If I could say, I think those removals, it's like, I'm so interested in poetry because it takes a technology that is language that has a prescribed use and function and subverts it.
Yes.
And I think I'm interested in to a degree. I mean, all artists who use photography are doing that to a degree, but I think I am particularly excited about it because of how much I'm not revealing, and how I am intentionally sort of evading a traditional narrative arc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is how poetry functions.
Yeah, especially with the classic use of direct address, right? I think it functions in a very similar way as well in poetry, and you know, the epistolary format as well. In that similar space that you're kind of ebbing in. I actually have two questions in the Q&A that I wanted to get to you that I actually hadn't paid attention to initially with my own questions. So this first one says, Robert Mapplethorpe wrote, "Sex is magic if you channel it right. There's more energy in sex than art." And he said, is there any comment that you have on that?
I have a hard time thinking about anything Mapplethorpe said anymore and being excited about it because of the amount of information that has come out in recent years about what a racist he was. But so it's like my gut reaction is just, I always have, always a, which I resent because there was a time where I really loved those pictures and I feel like they've been taken away from me. But to speak to that just quote, which is what I said was unrelated. You gave an amazing quote and I didn't respond to it, but yes, I mean, I think sex is magic, sure, but that sounds like kind of a rock starry thing to say. And that's so Mapplethorpe. I think of sex as being really meaningful and and having, yeah, a lot of potential for meaning. And I think where Mapplethorpe seemed kind of attracted to the shock value of his practice, I actually was surprised to find that anyone was shocked by what I was doing, because it's 2021 and so much work has been made that I thought I would get away with avoiding some of that shockingness of the pictures. Because for me, these pictures are about interpersonal relationships, and sex is, it's definitely sex in the pictures, and is euphoric and jubilant, and but it's so much more about meaning making. And if I think about sex generally, or this word that gets thrown around sometimes with the work pornography, which is fine by me also, it's that, like, I sort of resent that people could potentially look at the pictures and not see them as all of these things that I think they are. And I guess the pictures are also in part a kind of argument for the value of sex culturally. And I guess I'm always fascinated. This is a long-winded answer / non-answer, but I'm always fascinated by the reluctance in the art world to engage sex and take it seriously. And it is from where most of our baggage and joy is derived. And it's so strange to me that that would somehow be off taboo or off limits for, you know, a certain brand of creative intellectual or something. But yeah, I don't know.
No, absolutely. I don't think that was a long-winded answer. I think you engaged the question well. I actually wanted to extend that to Paul as well. When you're talking about the art world, thinking of sex and, you know, the art making of it being taboo. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about that, Paul, being a gallerist and, you know, curating exhibitions in your space.
It's funny you bring that up, because I was going to tell Mark this, and I haven't yet, but I got my first email from like somebody who had passed by the gallery. So I'm like on the ground floor facing the street, and it's like a big window, and they wrote me a message and they said, you know, I pass by every day with my family, and I think some of the photos in the show are offensive, and I suggest you put a curtain up. And this is something that like Mark and I had spoken about, and that I, you know, had no concern about in the beginning, but which Mark had expressed some mild concern about, just in terms of like the imagery. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel very like kind of cowboy about it. Like we are in a space which is like, yeah, let's say the art world and public people who appreciate art, who like have a kind of language for making these kind of inductive leaps. But like, I think I'm interested in like engaging language about like how to kind of bridge and like, you know, find language that bridges like just like a kind of everyday way of seeing into like understanding like the place of something that like, yeah, it does engage like explicit visual culture in a way, but then kind of, I mean, and does subvert it and open it up into a different space. And like, how do you translate that in a kind of public way? Because I do think it's sort of elitist to like sort of suggest just like, oh, well, you know, doesn't everybody have a kind of visual, I guess, sort of competency in that? But, you know, that is something that I definitely want to sort of explore a bit more, even just, yeah, in vis-a-vis that one correspondence. But yeah, for me, I'm like a queer brown man also. And so the work feels very biographical and personal to me, even, I mean, specifically with Mark, you know, we grew up in a very similar context, also in Southern California. And so that also kind of bears that kind of residue for me, specifically with his work. And so I feel very, yeah, kind of on board, because I just understand it very well, the way it's kind of performing again in terms of his own subjectivity. And yeah, how that can be very meaningful, to kind of, yeah, place yourself by proxy, like in this sort of situation.
Yeah.
So that's my answer.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Paul.
Yeah.
And then another question here. He made a disclaimer. Sorry that if you already talked about this, I was a little late, but could you talk a little bit about the tape you produced with your book and the motivation for that? This is a question directed to Mark.
Oh, the tape?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Nobody ever asks about that.
Nice, Neil.
Yeah, thank you. Music is like my number one love. And I actually used to do a radio show with a really good friend of mine at K-Chung. And it was called, actually, I don't know if I want to talk about it too much on the air, but so we had this radio show that was like a tongue-in-cheek, I'll just say, it was like this very tongue-in-cheek kind of sad boy radio show where we would just play music and sometimes talk about our troubles. And I mean, I guess getting back, it's not even that radio show really. So I was like the weird, I'm 37, so this activity is for people that are probably slightly older than me. Like I grew up with CDs, but for whatever reason, I was really attracted to mixtapes, and I was a record collector. And so I think between the ages of like, I don't know, 16 and 25, I used to make mixtapes the old-fashioned way, like put on a record, choose a song, or put on a CD, choose a song, record it to tape, make sure there was enough space, make the next song. And that's such a slow process of creating meaning and thinking about sequencing that I think has really informed the way, that and poetry, but those two things really inform, I think, the way that I think about sequencing. And sort of like in the book and in the exhibitions, and there are these moments where there's a kind of crescendo that feels so musical, and or there's a kind of pregnant pause. Sometimes I leave more space between pictures than I would with other pictures. They're not all evenly spaced out, and those are like the kinds of decisions that I would make on tapes as a kid. And I think also because, I music was my first love, that I was really excited about the prospect of creating an object in a limited edition that would kind of point towards that part of my personality or something for the especially nerdy interested party. And so we made like 100 tapes that came for like the first 100 books that people bought with a special like a donation print for Reach LA, which is an organization I care a lot about. And then I did it again. So for Tucson people who might be here, we have I did a kind of performance where I read from Maggie Nelson's Bluettes and chose songs about the color blue. And the kind of archive of that is going to be produced as a very limited blue colored tape for Mocha Tucson members, and that I'm gonna get a little stash of to give to friends, just because I love sharing music with people.
Sounds wonderful, Mark. That sounds wonderful. Thanks for that question, Neil.
Yeah, thank you.
We're coming on 4 o'clock here, 4:04. So I think we can, start to close out here, but I wanted to save space for any last thoughts you might have, Mark or Paul, about the exhibition, the work, to our audience members.
Yeah, no, I'm just grateful people showed up and wanted to hear all of us talk about this stuff. Thanks for your time.
Yeah. And thank you for your presentation, Mark. Paul, is there anything else you want to end with?
No, same as Mark. Just thank you everybody for coming, and yeah, thank you, Mark, for this beautiful presentation. I mean, even for me, it's very illuminating. I mean, every time I hear you speak, but also just in kind of relaying from the beginning to now.
Yeah, thank you both for being here today with us, for such a wonderful exhibition. Mark, I wish we were friends. I want to.
We can be. I want to talk poetry with you.
Yes, that's like my first love is poetry. And
amazing.
And performed, right? So I was, yeah, my heart was really there today with everything you were saying. So yeah, looking forward to becoming friends. And I would like to stop by the exhibition tomorrow. So I encourage everyone here in the audience today to stop by the exhibition. It's closing tomorrow. So we're very fortunate to have Mark and Paul here with us today to walk us through the exhibition. And again, thank you everyone that has been here with us. Happy Friday. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Again, thank you, Mark and Paul.
Thank you. Bye.